Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for attending and joining us this evening. I'm Holly Peterson, Director of Alumni Engagement for the University of Oxford. We're delighted to be joined tonight by Jonathan Maxwell and Andrew Lee. Andrew holds a doctorate in geography and matriculated at Hertford College, Oxford in 1989. He is the Communications Director of the Oxford Climate Alumni Network, OxCAN, and oversees its UK operations. He has served on OxCAN's directorate since 2022. Teaching in schools and universities around the world, Andrew has focused on strategies and pedagogy for advancing climate change education. He is currently an honorary lecturer and associate fellow at the Centre for Climate Change and Sustainability Education at University College London. He's also writing an annualized series on climate change aimed at young readers and inquiring minds. Jonathan Maxwell is founder and CEO of Sustainable Development Capital LLP. Jonathan matriculated at Lady Margaret Hall in 1992 and has 28 years experience in international finance, infrastructure, and private equity. Established by Jonathan in London in 2007, SDCL specializes in developing and investing in efficient and decentralized generation of energy, EDGE, infrastructure projects across the UK, Europe, North America, and Asia. SDCL has completed over 50 investments in 10 countries, involving more than 50,000 properties and 2.5 billion in capital. Jonathan was recently recognized by the independent Climate 100 list as one of the world's leading environmentalists. He is also a member of the Reuters Impact Climate Council. In 2023, he published his book, The Edge: How Competition for Resources is Pushing the World and its Climate to the Brink, and What We Can Do About It, focusing on the intersection between energy, climate, and geopolitical issues. We look forward really to hearing from you both, Jonathan and Andrew. Just a quick note, more generally, climate and the environment are a huge priority for Oxford. We've recently brought together Oxford's climate expertise on our website, and we'll share the link with you in the follow-up email to tonight's event. We were also the academic partner for the recent global Right Here, Right Now 24-hour symposium last month. And we'll share that link with you as well. You can watch it back. And we know that all of our academics, researchers, and alumni can and will have world-changing impact on climate. So we're very grateful to you for joining us this evening. A few quick housekeeping notes. Please note that the session will be recorded. And please use the Q&A box to post your questions. So if you have a question for Jonathan or Andrew, please put it in the Q&A box. I'm really looking forward to tonight's talk. And over to you, Andrew and Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Holly. It's a great pleasure to have this evening our event, our In Conversation event. I'd like to, well, visually anyway, for the moment, introduce Jonathan in the other window. And I've known Jonathan for a few years. I invited him to come and be the keynote speaker for a symposium that I was running in London. And then as editor of the Oxford Climate Alumni newsletter, and it was at the time when he was publishing his book, I had an opportunity to read and review it, which was a great pleasure and a very important message too, which I'll give an opportunity to speak about in a moment. But before I do that, just a little bit about OxCAN. OxCAN is the Oxford Climate Alumni Network. We have around about 1,400 members through our formal membership program, and a few other 100 members who connect to us via LinkedIn. And so we are a group of people who are either working in or interested in the climate crisis. And the idea is for us to support and let people learn more about the climate crisis, network, connect with university, and so on. So it's an active group. It has a very good number, and our programs are increasing, and especially in terms of events such as this, and hopefully in the future some more events in Oxford and even in London. So do visit our website, the Oxford Climate Alumni Network, and also join us on LinkedIn. In any case, it's a very great pleasure for me to introduce to you Jonathan Maxwell and his book, The Edge. As I said, I reviewed before, but I'm not going to carry on like this. I'm going to give him an opportunity to tell us a little bit about it. And then after that, we're going to move on to a series of questions that, as it were, drill down to some of the tin tacks of the issues that are dealt with in the work. So, Jonathan, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about The Edge.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you for inviting me back to one of your discussions and events. I guess I started thinking about the edge a really long time ago when I set up Sustainable Development Capital in 2007. There were a lot of trends that were happening at that time. Effectively, the sort of confluence of the environmental challenges on the economy, and I was sort of following that as an investor in China, where I spent a lot of time working for HSBC, and indeed back here in Europe and North America. I decided in 2007 I wanted to focus my time, attention, career on investing in environmental infrastructure. And the fundamental question is, how does energy relate to the economy? How does energy relate to climate? And I guess what I discovered over the next 15 years is that it relates a lot to energy and to economy and climate. But the other feature which it interacts with is politics, and to a very substantial extent, geopolitics. Indeed, I discovered energy is a very important driver of geopolitical change and challenge, and indeed, in some respects, it causes geopolitical disruption and conflict, sometimes as much as it does cause climate change. So, Andrew, that's why I wrote the book. It was as everybody remembers, in the sort of first quarter of 2022, world sort of turned upside down when Russia invaded Ukraine. And one of the inspirations for the book was really just to start, well, this is where it starts, is telling the story of just this extraordinary relationship between Russia and Europe around oil and gas, particularly around gas, and the extraordinary disruption that happened to that relationship with the Russia-Ukraine invasion. In fact, the relationship between that gas nexus between Russia and Europe and the crisis in the first place, hence the sort of the dialogue that I set up in the book, which is really trying to explain not just how overconsumption of energy creates environmental challenges like climate change, I think, which people have become more familiar with in the last 20 years, but frankly, calling it out for what it is, Andrew, the fact that competition for the same resources that are creating climate change, that is energy, and particularly overconsumption, which creates competition, is also creating conflict. And, I think the Russia-Ukraine crisis is a tragic example of that. But the book also picks up other flashpoints around the world where there is, growing danger that energy conflicts and or resource conflicts, including metals, minerals, and other elements of critical supply chains, can come about through overconsumption. Great examples being Southeast Asia and the Arctic. So that was really the origin story, Andrew, of the book. It was, as an investor, I've been very deeply embedded in this market for a long time, investing in energy, but recognize the interrelationship between energy conflict. And the last thing I'll say is I also recognize, and this is slightly more optimistic, hopefully, that actually there's something that the economy, that market participants, that civil society can actually do about this. Wait, how's that possible? How's it possible that we could do such a thing as that actually any of us actually make a difference to global issues like climate and conflict? Well, one of the extraordinary features, and I'll end with this opening question, is that I discovered over 15, 16 years of my investment in the market was that this energy resource, Andrew, that causes climate and conflict, wow, the biggest, dirtiest secret of the energy sector I discovered on my journey is the following, and that's that most of it's wasted. So such an extraordinary feature, and therefore I thought, if we could look at ways that we can stop that, or at least come up with much better solutions that waste less. Then there will be less climate change, and there will be less competition for these resources that go conflict. So there's an optimistic book. It's calling out for what it is, this extraordinary overconsumption of resource, the challenges that creates, but it's also the framework for a better path forward for economies, business, and indeed for societies.
I mean, I guess with the nature of the global economy searching for every potential joule of energy, the very point that you make is that on the one hand we're searching for every joule, but on the other hand there's such wastage that is in some respects the low-hanging fruit in terms of dealing with the undersupply and over demand of energy, and is often the kind of elephant or the elephant in the room in
Yeah.
terms of what can be done. Why do you think that it's still overlooked? Why do you think that it is the elephant in the room? Why doesn't anybody notice? I mean, people do notice, obviously, but why doesn't it have the kind of power and cachet and impact that perhaps it should? And is that changing?
So I wrote an article about this a few months ago. It's actually called The Perfect Problem, and I tried to explain why it's a perfect problem. Um, the, and maybe just to start with what the problem is. In terms of the numbers, it's in the book because I had to publish this stuff because it's so unbelievable, Andrew, that if I say this, you would want it verified. And obviously, to write a book, I had to get it verified. But it's extraordinary, kind of the way it works in the energy system. About 10% of the world's energy, meaning things like fuel, gas, oil, and so on, which is most of the energy in the world, primary energy. About 10% of it gets lost just as it's being extracted and converted into something for the energy system, like a pipeline. So that's the first point of loss or waste. The second point is, for example, in the generation of energy, like electricity. So again, most of the world's energy, despite all of our best efforts over the last 20 years, 10 trillion invested in the market, still 80% of the world's energy is oil, gas, and coal. And the issue is that if you put that stuff into a power plant, and a lot of people don't know this, but just to sort of explain it slowly, if you put a molecule into a power plant, typically only half of the primary energy that goes into that power plant turns into electricity. Well, wait, what happens to the rest of it? You say, oh, it's not fair. Well, everybody remembers in their rudimentary physics or thermodynamics, it turns into heat. It doesn't go nowhere, it turns into heat. So the problem is, if you've got a centralized energy center, half of the energy goes to electricity, great, but the other half is dumped. It just, where does it go? It just disappears up into, as heat actually goes up into space. They don't need it up there. So by the time that the energy's got out of a power plant, about 60% of it's been wasted. Remember, 10% in extraction and conversion, 50% plus in the generation process. And then another 5 or 10% of energy gets lost through what they call the transmission distribution network. So this is the extraordinary world we live in, which kind of might even be manageable-ish, not really, if by the time the energy got to where it was needed, it's not wasted more. So for example, in industry and buildings and transport. So why does all of this happen? It's because each element of the value chain is trying to be as economically efficient as it can. The extraction guys, there's good reasons why they're dumping 10%. The generation guys are motivated to produce electricity for the grid, and that's what they get paid for. So there's no disincentive on the heat. And likewise, T&D networks that try to optimize for financial return. So the point is, while each individual point of this process is pretty perfect, I'm not going out there and saying that I could make a better gas turbine than Siemens or GE. They're amazing, they're big customers. But it's what you do with that technology. It's where you place it. And the way that the world works is what we've built centralized infrastructure, centralized energy networks. But we've now got to understand that that's part of the problem. Although we've perfected how to do that pretty much, it's the wrong configuration. What we need to do is decentralize, bring the energy to the point of use, and then much less of it gets lost in transmission and distribution.
Yeah.
And you can use the heat for productive purposes rather than sending it into space. And that is such a big part of what the D in the edge stands for, decentralized.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in some respects, and it's analogous to, the increased efficiency that we have with devices, and computers no longer running cooler as opposed to energy being expended in heat.
Right.
And also analogous to the amount of water that we lose through the leakage in the water system, because once again another example of wastage, and the water that is generated or provided just doesn't get to its destination. Um, let's move on a little bit to how ESG is unfolding.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of criticism of the way that ESG is unfolding, that has been patchy. How is that process pulling into focus, do you think?
I think there's been a pendulum swing. If I sort of, I was actually involved fairly early in the swinging of the pendulum. In 2007, I set up this company, Sustainable Development Capital, and so few people cared about sustainable development at the time that I was able to buy the name of the company, Sustainable Development Capital. But 2007 was an early date here. I mean, there were no iPhones, there were no Spice Girls, there was no Nobel Prize for the UNIPCCC, and so this was an early doors, to be fair. But I would say in the second half of the 2010s, so particularly 2018 onwards, you saw this enormous upsurge in ESG interest, and I think it was this sort of what had happened was a realization that actually that was possible to do well by doing good. As I said, now about $10 trillion has been invested in the renewables and grid over the last 20 years. So this is big business, and I think there were a number of companies that were starting to do well, through a combination of market incentives introduced by government, but in certain pockets of the market, candidly, just by doing good business in the space. And I think it led to an incredible surge in the interest of companies and even investors to load up on ESG as a business tool. How could I sell more product by positioning it as a green product? How could I, meet consumer expectations or hopes? And then from an investment perspective, frankly, how can I raise hundreds of billions of dollars of assets under management for investment firms to invest in the space? Very compelling argument, do well by doing good. And I think, in fact, that's where it all started many years ago. So that's where the ESG acronym started. So I think, but the challenge with that was we started to see I think the ESG wheels creaking. I think it was potentially overused. I think it was exploited in some cases. So there were some genuine, or at least legal cases that were prosecuted with an outcome that suggested that they were genuine stretches or misuses of the ESG, label. You had a number of companies taken to task by regulators and by advertising bodies and so on, saying that it's not quite true. You're overstating your environmental credentials. I think I also saw in the financial sector, and I've written about it in the book on the chapter on ESG and greenwash. Some growing skepticism, I should say, in 2021, 2022, that some of these environmental ESG products were not actually that environmental or ESG at all. There were indices which looked backwards and negatively screened, but didn't have much to do. Frankly, it meant to be ESG indices, but didn't really have much to do with ESG. I remember looking at the contents of some of the indices that I won't name today, back in 2021, 2022, and they effectively with what we would call today the Magnificent Seven plus a few. So in other words, if you're a software company, you could pretend that you weren't a heavy emitting industrial, so all of a sudden you were in the sustainability index. Great companies, by the way, amazing, good to buy, but not necessarily the environmental metric as the leading rationale for that. So the backlash started in 21, 22. I think it hit very hard on the political crosshairs in 22, 23. Started to see Republican states really railing against investors who were putting money to work, particularly when returns were getting challenged, putting money to work in the ESG markets. And then, all I would say is if you then fast forward to today, enormous outflows from capital markets, a lot of what I would call green hushing, because people are just too scared to promote their environmental credentials lest they get sued. And I think what's now hopefully coming back, I'm just going to leave on a final optimistic note, is some degree of sense and pendulum swinging back into the center. So, I think regulators are probably over-regulated. There's an alphabet soup of different acronyms that financial consumer regulators came out with. And I think it's settling down a little bit in the market now. And I think people are starting to get to grips with what's real and authentic. So I'm slightly more optimistic, but it's certainly been a roller coaster.
So do you think that the ESG dimension and the sustainability credentials of companies is becoming self-perpetuating in such a way that it's something that they're doing intrinsically rather than necessarily patching it together with some bankability aspect, and there is a sort of sense that they actually want to be good corporate citizens?
So I think that you've got to kind of divide this into three categories. You've got consumers, you've got business slash investors, corporate world, and then you've got the governments. I think consumers, and I've got a whole chapter on media and sort of attitudes towards the environment. Generally, consumers, individuals like us, care about the environment. Frankly, on both sides of the political aisle, and I keep going back to America, but it's an important driver of everything. And what I found was that there's a centre ground of 60 or 70% of the global population who cares a lot about environmental and even climate issues without necessarily having to go to one extreme or another. There's also, by the way, an extreme of climate and environmentalists, and there's also an extreme of people that are facing off against that. But frankly, the bulk of consumer society is kind of broadly aligned. Republicans big on their local community, their family, their safety, their local community, the air and the water and all the rest of it. Democrats much more interested in society, and I would say that probably more or less translates into British politics as well. But that's kind of consumer. The reason I say that is that then tracks up into how companies and investors respond. Companies want to sell into that marketplace. And investors want to sell into that marketplace too. And then you end up in two places, one of which is either you're overselling, or sorry, either overselling or at risk if the returns don't look great because you depend on the third element I'll come to in a second, which is government subsidy.
Yeah.
So that's one path you can take. The other path you can take is it's just better business. And that's the bit, Andrew, that I'm trying to get into into the business community and the investor community, because at the end of the day, if you're more efficient, whether it's with energy, water, or food, which is most of its way, all of those things are wasted, then you can deliver better solution into the market at lower cost. So it's better and lower cost and more environmentally friendly and more resilient. And then the last thing is you've got the government. And I think then you do have these political swings and movements around the bases. But I also am sort of moderately optimistic, particularly in Europe, and then even prospectively in the US, that efficiency at least can win. I think that there's all sorts of juries out in terms of whether or not you should be green or brown or drill baby drill or go solar. But at the end of the day, something that's really compelling politically is how do I deliver the same or better economic output just using less, therefore improving productivity and competitiveness. So that's where I think ESG probably lands. If it's meant to land, I'm going to burn returns on the altar of the environment. It's not going to work. It's not sustainable. If it's not commercial, it's not sustainable. And that's unfortunately, it's another hard truth for the market. But the good news is there are ways of being commercial and sustainable environmentally, and that's by being more efficient. That's the lens that you've got to have, though.
And I mean, the other thing too, looking at demography, the research that I conducted was looking at young people because I was concerned the degree to which they might be becoming exhausted by the climate talk. But actually, I found that was quite the contrary. And the young people of today are going to be the investors of tomorrow, and that they're not going to only look at what a company is doing today, but actually what their corporate history is. And so that's interesting perspective on that too as it unfolds. As a historian, you'll know. What about just moving? You did mention before about building a better generator than Siemens, but the whole prospect of retrofitting infrastructure, is that, are we where we need to be? What do you think?
Well, I think that there are two areas of retrofit which I think are really exciting. One's infrastructure, one's buildings. And by the way, on infrastructure, I'm going to include elements of transport networks in terms of infrastructure supply as well. So I'm quite excited about the kind of medium long-term transition of the infrastructure that goes into the transport networks. We've got to remember that electricity is nowhere yet in transport. It's
Yeah.
less than 1% of the global transport market. It's nowhere flying and in boats. But I do think that from what I'm seeing, that retrofit story of taking existing fleets and changing them. I go there, Andrew, because it's 30% of the world's energy use. But that I think is interesting. Buildings I think are super interesting. They waste about 30 to 40% of the energy in the world, and they use about 40% of the energy in the world. So it gives you a sense of the scale of gigaton scale opportunities, gigatons of scale that you could take out of buildings. And then infrastructure, it's extraordinary that if you include obviously energy infrastructure is a massive part of that. So changing existing energy infrastructure for cleaner, more efficient energy infrastructure, 100% for sure. We see a lot of opportunities. We're making a lot of investment in that market. But one fun area of infrastructure is basically what's going on behind the scenes on today's call. So data centers, a lot of people classify these days as infrastructure too. And I think probably the new news to me, which I wouldn't have been able to answer this way 3 weeks ago, was the new news to me is that market's moving so quickly. So, if you put up a new data center today for an AI application, what is moving so quickly, Andrew, that the minute these things are installed, the operators are having to look straight away at retrofit. Why? Because the equipment inside the building needs to be replaced in 3 years' time. So I do think that retrofit market for infrastructure all across the board, from buildings, industry, transport into the new economy, is going to be a huge driver. But one thing I'll lastly say is, unfortunately, unless we get the supply side right, remember that roughly half to two-thirds of the energy is lost before it even gets to the front door of the infrastructure. Then I think we're probably not going to win this battle. So it's both. So I think we have to retrofit and be much more efficient in supplying energy and other resources.
How do you think, I'm sorry, I'm going off piste here a little bit, but the impact of artificial intelligence in terms of helping us make better decisions in terms of managing energy and energy transition? I mean, are we still waiting for a moment where things might change very quickly? Of course, from a broader energy perspective, developments such as fusion, etc., are enormously positive. But from an AI point of view, and the way that we might model and even affecting building change through efficiencies and better ways of doing things, do you think that we're on a cusp of change?
I think that, I'm always amazed about what AI can do. So yes, I think the opportunity to optimize and tune and be creative using AI in terms of finding new ways. I have a very rudimentary AI system that operates in my house here where I'm sitting today. I store energy at night when I charge my batteries, and I then discharge it during the day. I don't do that because I have to go to work, but my little sort of computer does it, and it knows when it needs to dispatch and charge, and it saves me a lot of money. And candidly, that enables my house to run on zero carbon energy where it might not otherwise. So there are sort of examples of like that. I'm just going to be slightly facetious and come back at you with this, though. I think there's a ton of human intelligence to do before we rely on artificial intelligence bailing us out. We are incredibly dumb in the way, not just we are humanly unintelligent compared to the artificial intelligence. We need to fix that problem first. We are, I'll come back to it. I'm going to keep bumping the table. In America, 2/3 of the whole primary energy supply of America is wasted before it even gets to the point of use. Think about the money involved with that. It's $4 trillion is what America spends on energy. And if you think that a good $2.5 trillion of that is wasted or lost somewhere in the system, then there's a lot that human beings with hammers, spanners, pipes and wires can do. first before artificial intelligence comes to our rescue. So, and last thing I'll say about that is artificial intelligence, in my lived experience, uses about 10 times the amount of energy of conventional computing. And I know that there are numbers out there that talk about much larger, even orders of magnitude. But let's get smart first, I think, before we hope for AI to bail us out.
That's more of an attitudinal change than the fact that AI might well help bail us out, but we've got to think straight first. Yeah.
Well, I'll give you one. Sorry, I know that you don't want to go on too much about this, but just give you one example of that, of how humanly dumb we are on this point. And you can tell me if you disagree with me on this point because you meet a lot of people too. But I'm in this industry, been in it for a really long time. We deal with buildings, industry, transport of the world, operate in 10 countries. I've got 50,000 projects connected to our buildings. I employ 400 people. Not once have I come across a customer that has an employee with the following job title: Chief Energy Officer.
Right.
Not once. So wait, hold on a second. What's going on? So that's it's just an expression of how far we have to go in thinking about this. Companies have not put energy very high up on their agenda before. They didn't. Why? Because they took it for granted. They thought that they were secure. They're not, because war happened in Europe and weather happens in America.
Yeah.
They thought that it was abundant and cheap. It's not about carbon, and boy, do you have to do that now. So those three things have changed, and that's what humans need to do first, which is start to get people in the right seats, thinking about the right issues. And if it wasn't costing so much money, I wouldn't think that companies and countries should care that much about it, but boy, should they.
What do we've got a net zero plan by 2050. Do you think we are on track for that path, even viably? Do you think we have we're carrying a lot of misconceptions? Tell me a little bit about what you think about that.
I think three things have got to happen in the two biggest, and then there's one that is a sine qua non. The two biggest ones is that we have to do a step change in efficiency. So on the energy side of the equation, which is the biggest greenhouse gas contribution, we need to be much more efficient and frankly get a long way towards eliminating the waste that I've discussed. The other thing we need to do is definitely to generate new clean energy supply, but use efficiency as a lens. If somebody tells you that it's 22% efficient to make hydrogen, it's probably a good indication that you might not want to do that to make power. So just use efficiency as a lens and just think about the electrical efficiency of the system. So things like solar, cost competitive wind, these things can make a lot of sense, particularly as a distributed generation tool rather than plugged into the grid exclusively. So I would say renewables, but the renewable doesn't work without efficiency, either in terms of decentralizing the network or just applying the lens of efficiency to production. We're wasting enormous amounts of time and money on the wrong technology sometimes. And I think applying that efficiency lens would be helpful. And then the third thing is that we're talking about net. I mean, let's be clear. On the generation side, there is no such thing as zero carbon generation. I'd go as far as to say just between us and the 1,400 people listening here, it's a fantasy. Every production of energy effectively creates carbon pollution of some description, but saving it, being much more efficient, can help. Surely that's part of the net. But the third element, I mentioned there were three elements: renewables, efficiency. The third element is actually land management. So, without this is outside of the scope of my business, but it's inside the scope of what is my book. Without actually managing the world's ecosystems, and particularly the forests, we are not going to have, enough sequestration of carbon. And if we're not going to manage that sort of ecological side of our equation, we're going to have other problems to worry about too, not just on climate related issues. So I think those are the three things that got to happen. I think countries can do a tremendous amount around the renewable generation. I think companies can do a tremendous amount around the efficiency story. I think governments should insist that we're not allowed to be inefficient. I think that's like one of the simple regulatory tools that could be used. And then the third one, probably the toughest nut to crack, to get to your question, which is about net zero and whether or not it can happen. The basic answer is unless we look after the natural capital of the world, and again, this is not my business, but it is my interest in the book.
Yeah.
Unless we look after natural capital, we're not going to get to net zero. That I would say is practically impossible.
Mm, mm. I mean, the points you said there about, governments needing to regulate and more, still a lot of the investment has to come from private funds.
Yes.
And, do you think the market can actually deliver the kind of change that is needed? And that, of course, is in the face of the fact that, much investment needs to happen in the global south and countries that are developing, and many facing, some of the worst climate disasters,
Yeah.
and whose economies are pretty problematic.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I've been going to these sort of conference of party the top meetings, pretty much every year since I started the firm, and probably the oldest debate, the most difficult and horrible one that happens every year is this debate about the transfer of sort of almost reparations from the developed world to the developing world, and I think what strikes me every year is that, and I'm trying not to be too controversial here, but the first thing is that the developed world has got a lot of responsibility for the level of pollution in the world, and energy and carbon being primary examples. And to my point, if so much of that is happening at the same time as we're wasting the resources that we're burning, that's creating the pollution, then I think that's probably the first problem that needs to get solved. Sorry to keep coming back to it, but the analogy I would use is a bucket. If you're pouring a more beautiful product, whether it's any type of resource like energy into into a bucket, but it's got a hole in the bottom. That's what the inefficiency story is right now. There's nothing much we can do if the system is broken because it's inefficient. So, I think the West and the developed markets need to get their efficiency story straight. They need to clean up their own backyard. And they also need, which I think they've been doing to be semi-fair, I think they need to drive innovation to the point where you can get cost competition. It's just as good, if not cheaper, to generate energy and other critical resources, with clean rather than dirty technology solutions. I think at that point, then there's an opportunity for the developing world to leapfrog, and that's what's happening in a number of cases as well. But having said that, last thing I'll say is, the developing world has got some challenges to address too, just as the developed world does, sadly now, which is around governance. I think again, I think this is a much more difficult discussion I have at the COPs, which is, there's a lot of question about why isn't more money going into emerging markets. Well, it's because these countries have poor credit standing for various reasons, and it's not just for societal and business reasons. It's because of governance and the way that governments are set up and how money flows. So, there are, I think, international as well as local and national governmental changes and regulations and mechanics that need to be put in place. It is sad in certain markets where you see such incredible opportunity for the population, but just like my leaky bucket on energy and policy in developed markets, you can see some leaky buckets in terms of flows of funds into emerging markets, and I think that's something that we need to be more honest about as an international community.
But how do we deal with that? How do we deal with the fact that we've got countries that it's almost impossible to invest in, who have enormous problems? How can the market?
Are you talking about America or development? I'm joking. I'm joking.
Yeah, I mean, how do we solve those bigger global problems? The political issues facing a lot of these countries are not going to go away, and at the end of the day, we've got people who are in pretty poor shape.
So, I mean, look, I come back to it. Most of the world's sort of challenges are coming from markets which are not developing; they're developed. Um, And a lot of the innovation is being driven in markets which have been labeled as developing, but that are frankly some of the most powerful and fast growing and
Yeah,
important global markets. Great example is China, where I started my environmental journey. I mean, there's a chapter in my book again about sort of policy levers that have been pulled by various governments around the world, almost nowhere more than in terms of kind of the clean energy renewable marketplace than in China at the moment. But there are some hard truths there, Andrew. In order to get off carbon, China's going to have to go through not just building out incredible amounts of renewables, which it is, but it's also building out coal-fired power stations at the same
yeah,
time, nuclear power stations. It's such a vast challenge. When I wrote the book, it was 60% coal, 6% natural gas. In a lot of other markets in the world are the other way around, 6% coal, 60% nat gas. In
yeah,
fact, the biggest, and again, this won't make me very popular, but to say this, but probably the biggest decarbonisation outcome of living memory was the shift from coal to gas in America. That shift will happen in China. So there are stepping stones, and then of course the penetration of renewables um, in due course will step up. Renewables is mostly electricity, and electricity is only 20% of the world's energy supply.
yeah.
So there's such a long way to go. So these steps are going to have to happen, and I'm not sure they are universally accepted, understood, or like. But these kind of coal to gas steps will have to happen in certain markets, and there are some unsavory politically difficult choices to make there as well about the sort of fuel and various other things. It's a complex tapestry here, but I'm not in the business of lecturing emerging markets or developing markets about their environmental footprint when, frankly, the environmental footprint of the West and candidly, even some of the major economies in the East has a lot further to go before we're in any position to provide a lecture.
Mm. Jonathan, we've got some questions coming in, so we might switch over to those. A question for Jonathan on whether investors and especially infra and energy operators are ready to invest in climate adaptation and resilience, particularly in emerging markets in the global south.
So I mean, resilience or energy security and security in general, and resilience is, and the words mission critical are all, sort of key words, I would say, from 22, 23 onwards. Why Europe had this kind of sort of war catastrophe, gas catastrophe, as they called it, after the Russian invasion, Russian Ukraine invasion, and the concept of resilience completely changed into it wasn't just about climate resilience, which I think is a very big and yes is the answer feature of investment happening now across Europe, flood defenses and so on. But I also think because of energy resilience, energy security, America actually has had resilience and adaptation investment for a very, very long time. We just don't think about it like that. But the major driver of the decentralized energy networks that have made America safer from all sorts of perspective, hospitals safer, other mission critical infrastructure is, and this might sound ironic because it's not famous for it, is climate adaptation. The reason America has done this is because it's like while we've been worried about the war, America for many last couple of decades at least has been very worried about the extreme weather events from natural disasters, and when those happen, Superstorm Sandy, New York, Florida, Texas, and so on, California. This has spurred investment in on-site generation. So if the grid goes down, you don't fail. And I think that's really been a major driver of decentralized and therefore more efficient infrastructure. When it comes to emerging markets, I would just expect the same. As I said, I'm not really in the business of lecturing, sort of other countries on what they should be doing, but a lot of a lot of the developing markets and emerging markets in which we source, operate, or I've invested over my career, these are great countries, and under the right sort of corporate governance, under the right legal frameworks, and with the right government oversight, and then I say the right government oversight, then I think resilience and adaptation is going to be a really important point. Yeah, I mean, I remember talking about adaptation and resilience 20 years ago. Everybody literally glazed it over. Mitigation is what everybody was interested in investing in today. I think of the three main drivers of our business, they are security, cost, and carbon. And I would say security is the first one. So I would expect to see a lot more on resilience going forward.
Mm.
And adaptation, obviously, to what's happening out there on climate. We've seen, incredible, extraordinary, terrifying temperature rises and extreme weather events. However they're attributed, we're going to have to invest in defense against that. So, other side of the coin.
But that's going to disappear somewhat under the current administration in the US, presumably.
Not so well. Yes and no. So again, I mean, this is just from the horse's mouth, if you can call me the horse. But I was in New York last week. I actually go to the States every 3 weeks because most of our investments are there. There are still more than half of the states in America have very broadly defined climate friendly policy. So it's not always for particularly happy clappy reasons. As I said, it's driven by security and it's driven by cost as much by carbon and the environment. But I think the general message from those states is, look, it doesn't. We're carrying on. Thank you very much. We've got our own constituency to look after. I think there's been a bit of a backlash. Well, at least backlash is a strong word, but challenge and frustration from some of the red states, which benefit the most actually from the market incentive regime. But I also come back to my sort of fundamental point, which is that there are ways of getting things done which are good for the environment, good for people, good for resilience, that cost less. And you know what? The reason for that, if you keep hammering on, is that's what gets me out of bed every morning. I get so excited and optimistic because if this problem that we were trying to solve, climate environment, was all about trying to find out a new technology to the point you made, Andrew, to do more, like just produce more renewable power, more this, more that, I would find that quite depressing because there's a limit to what we can do. There's even a limit to time, resource, money. But if it's a true story that we're wasting most of this stuff in the first place, the incredible opportunity to be efficient and to do better and to be more productive, more competitive, and to make money out of that very approach, that's what really motivates me.
Absolutely. Look, we have I'm just conscious of the time. We've got a couple of other questions here. Why is it that most organizations are not looking at energy wastage whilst they focus so much on other issues like which will make much smaller bottom line differences?
Yeah. Look, I think it's a very important question, and I'm not going to defend any companies against it. I would actually say the same thing. I think a lot of the reporting standards and accounting practices and labeling things risk sometimes, trying to be polite here, missing the point. I think that's absolutely right. If you're in a company that is procuring energy and it's one of your biggest overheads, but yet you're pulling it in through the grid and it's much more expensive than it could be if you built on-site generation. Or just as bad if you're using energy but 30% of it in the copper business. I was with a group of copper CEOs and chairmen a couple of years ago in a round table, and the general consensus was that about 30% of the energy in these mining operations was wasted. It's not amazing. And said to them, well, why don't you do something about it? What is the upfront cost? I'm like, well, I'll invest. So, I think the answer is it's not necessarily at the top of the sort of worry list for these organizations. They may not know where the challenges are in their organization. I don't think that's necessarily okay. If I were a shareholder of a major company and I knew that they were overpaying for the energy that they were getting and they were wasting a third of it, and that was costing them, I'd be just as angry as I would about the CEO, salary, which everybody gets worked up about. But wait, there are much bigger numbers flying out of the door of the chimney every day.
And they're the ones that need to employ the chief energy officer.
Yes.
Officers. The next question says, could you sorry, I'm just scrolling here. Can you expand on the decentralized energy networks in the UK? What is the pathway to transition away from the national grid?
So the good news is we don't need to transition away from the national grid, but I think we need to build more energy generation closer to the point of use so that the grid becomes a partner or even a backup system. So I mean, great examples of this is, data, and this is happening actually in certain markets with very constrained grids like Ireland. So you're starting to see data centers having to bring their own generation. Um, I don't mean to sound funny like a bring your own bottle, but it is a little bit like bring your own power. And I think that concept is a very important one. If you're going to put another 100 megawatts of load onto the electricity network because you're building a hyperscale data center, if you're going to disturb the local network and create what's happened across the US, which is harmonics problems, in other words, frequency disruptions, probably why I can't use um, my other line at the moment, Andrew, for this discussion. This isn't a good example. I think decentralizing will be part of I think, a technological breakthrough. You asked about AI earlier. AI, I think, will be a bit like motor racing or war. It's the kind of thing which generates technological innovation, because without technological innovation, you can't do motor racing better and get your car to go faster. And
Yeah.
you can't fight wars better. So I think AI is going to be a huge stimulus to that. Um, but hospitals are another great example. I think it's terrible that the NHS procures its energy from the grid, whereas it could generate energy lower cost, lower carbon on site using anything from cogeneration to solar and storage and so on. I also think it's terrible that only half of its lights have been changed to LED. It just wastes energy inside. So I think the answer to the question about decentralization and efficiency is I think it should come from the big end energy users. And the last point I'll make about that, and although I don't usually go on about this, that's where the government can make the biggest difference, not by subsidizing everything, but taking the 15% of all the energy it uses in the country and actually doing something about that. Don't
Yeah.
let the NHS, the Ministry of Defence, the Department for Education, and everybody else waste all this energy. Do something about that, and then you can go and lecture industry and business, and then they can go and make the changes. Go hire an energy officer and get on with it.
So the next leads into the next question in terms of what action can and needs to be taken by inventors, governments, others to reduce the waste in the generation of electricity that you've been talking about. What are the mechanics?
Yeah, so I think that again, I've written about this, but there are some specific regulatory interventions that I think can be made to set targets for for reduction of energy use per unit of GDP output. Best one I've ever seen anywhere in the world was actually introduced nearly 20 years ago in China. They insisted that as an economy as a whole, they should use 4% less energy each year to make the same or more economic output. That's 20% over every 5-year plan. And my goodness, have they been ruthless about delivering against that target. So national or regional energy efficiency targets. And do you know what happened? I remember in August 2022, you might remember this, Andrew, when after the Russia-Ukraine crisis and energy was so expensive, Germany told everybody to turn their lights off and the fountains off. The European Commission told everybody to reduce the amount of electricity they use by 5% across the whole region. Do you know what happened? They did it and it was okay. Okay, there was a very, very, very difficult situation that brewed for industry in Europe, and that's because it was running on centralized networks and we waste most of the energy. So all this came home to roost. So
Yes.
governments can do things like regulate, set targets, but also I think, candidly, I wouldn't be upset to see governments enforce, basically saying you need to measure, monitor your energy waste. And if you're doing it, it's not okay. It's actually just not okay. We will
Yeah.
regulate against it. There have been some good European-wide initiatives to decentralize energy where you can. It's quite hard to build solar panels on your roof. It's not difficult from a physical perspective, but from planning, regs, and that sort of thing. So Europe made some sweeping simplifications to the planning process to allow that to happen. These are the sorts of things we could do in this country. I mean, there's been some I hope there's nobody from the government on the line today and take offence at this comment, or maybe if they were not in the previous administration, they can harness this comment. But there have been some wishy-washy attempts to look at concepts like efficiency over the years, but nothing actually has been done about it that's substantial in public or industry or building sector. So, if anybody's listening, I'm all in and making that change. Why? Because it's good for the economy. As an investor, I would invest in it tomorrow. I do every day. And indeed, last point there is we have a brilliant fund which we manage for our own capital, but also the capital we manage for the Mayor of London's GLA. And that's aimed at decarbonising London. And it's specifically there to do exactly what we're talking about. So I think there are things that we can do that are regulatory, that are sort of policy and target driven, but actually also some physical stuff we could do, which is get out there and make our stuff better.
Yes, it's interesting. It's not quite energy, but it's water related, so hence sustainability and not unconnected. But in Oxford last week, I was meeting with the new rector of Lincoln, and who apologised for the quad being quite brown, and he said that they had saved in deciding not to irrigate when there's water shortages in Oxford. They had saved some 2,000 litres of water, but the other colleges and just independently had done the same. So the quadrangles in Oxford were rather dry, much to the annoyance of many visiting alumni. But the point is that it is a matter of drawing in and cutting down, and it can be done, yeah. And there are costs. I mean, that's a water example, not a direct energy example, but yeah, absolutely. Things a difference can be made. We've got to finish up, Jonathan. I'm sorry to those people who have posted questions towards the end. We didn't quite get to those, but I tried to field as many of them as I could. So I'm going to hand over now to Holly. And so I think, I'm not sure, Holly, do you want us to stay on camera or for us to evaporate?
You're very welcome to stay on camera, Andrew. Thank you so much. I just wanted to wrap up to say what a great session. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us tonight, and thank you hugely to you both, Andrew, for helping us pull the session together alongside Jonathan. We really appreciate you giving up your time this evening to share some great insights with our audience. Thank you. I found it fascinating. Participants, you will receive a follow-up email with links to OxCAN, as well as information on the university's ongoing research on climate and the environment. Please do make sure to keep an eye as well on your emails for your invitation to Meeting Minds, which will be launched very soon, and we hope to welcome you back to Oxford in September. And just to say thank you once again to everyone, and have a lovely evening.
Thanks to you, Holly, and to Jonathan, and to the team.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.